Hey, fourth graders, it's Mrs. Ramsey. I have another read aloud for you today. It's out of this book, Escape from Slavery, Five Journeys to Freedom by Doreen Rappaport. The last time I read the story to you, it was called The River of Ice. And this story that I'm going to read is called Free Like the Wind. So here we go, Free Like the Wind. Every muscle in Dasha's neck and shoulders ached. He looked down from the tree at his horse, Free, wondering how he was faring after 2 hours. Free had been his father's horse before his father was killed 2 years earlier in an accident cutting stone. Dasha had named him Free because his father had never stopped thanking the Lord that he was born free instead of a slave. Dasha still missed him, but when he galloped over the fields with Free, it was like having part of his father with him. Dasha squinted his eyes and scanned the horizon. It was hard seeing. The sun, moving down to meet the earth, no longer warmed the air, but its strong rays obscured the details in the distance. It was a week since folks in Cabin Creek had gotten the news that slave hunters were around, tracking down the Jackson girls. Selena Jackson was 11, a year older than Dasha. Her sister Cornelia was a couple of years younger. Dasha didn't much like girls, but these two were different from most. He had to admit that. They'd made their way to Cabin Creek, Indiana from somewhere in Tennessee, over 200 miles away, hiding in thickets and caves during the day, scrounging for food in barns, eating pig slop to keep from starving. They had traveled in the pitch black of night, crossing mountains and swamps. Their only guide had been the North Star. He didn't know how they'd done it and had to admit that he wasn't sure that he could have. Folks in Cabin Creek were used to slave hunters coming after runaways. The black settlement was just north of a 6-mile stretch of wilderness that had been leveled by a tornado. Many slaves lost their pursuers in this tangle of huge downed trees and thick underbrush and ended up in Cabin Creek. Hounds couldn't follow the human scent when escaping slaves waded in the swamp or ran above ground, jumping from fallen limb to fallen limb. When the runaways got to Cabin Creek, folks hid them until they could get them farther north to Canada. Cabin Creek was only one of about 20 rural black settlements in Indiana. Slavery was forbidden in the Indiana Constitution, so free blacks and freed slaves immigrated here. Around 15 years earlier, in 1826, Dasha's parents and other free blacks from North Carolina had come to Cabin Creek. They'd drained the boggy land that white settlers didn't want. They'd turned it and tended it until the soil was rich enough to yield plentiful harvests. A group of white Quakers, who had also immigrated from North Carolina, raised money to tide the black community over until it was self-sufficient. Now, Cabin Creek had over 100 residents. It also had a whole system worked out to help runaways. Dasha's watch duty was only one part of the system. Dasha blinked his eyes at a flurry of motion about a mile or so away. Definitely riders. He waited another minute, hoping to distinguish how many, but he couldn't make it out. They were getting closer. He scampered down the tree, mounted Free, and kicked him hard. Free broke into a gallop almost immediately. A bullet from a shotgun whizzed by. Dasha's heart jumped like a scared rabbit. Another shot. He kicked Free harder. In the center of town, Dasha pulled in Free's reins, put a horn to his lips, gave a loud blast, then galloped off to a secluded spot about a quarter mile away. His friend, Samuel, was already there with his horse. Dasha left free with him and ran back to the center of town. When Bessie Watkins heard the horn, she ran to the window. 4 men on horseback were riding straight toward her cabin. There was no back door or back window to the cabin, and the men were too close to risk letting the girls out the front door. How'd they find out? She thought. There hadn't been any strangers around Cabin Creek for weeks, and it was unthinkable that anyone in town might have given them away. She rummaged through a drawer to get the clothes she'd saved for just this occasion. By the time the 4 men stopped in front of her cabin, about 50 townsfolk had already gathered. They formed a semicircle around the slave owner and the others, and then fanned out the length of 2 cabins on either side of the Watkins cabin. Dasha, standing near the front of the crowd, saw the glint of the sheriff's badge as he dismounted from his horse. The other 3 men stayed on their horses. "Watkins, it's the sheriff," he shouted. Bessie Watkins opened the door, a long, shiny knife in her left hand. "I'm assuming you want my husband." "He's not here," she said defiantly. "No matter," the sheriff replied. "Got a writ here that gives me the authority to search your premises for stolen property." "And what might that property be?" Her strong voice wavered a little bit. "2 of my slaves," shouted the slave owner, dismounting his horse. The man stood a head taller than the sheriff, with big, broad shoulders and thick arms. His hands were large and swollen around the knuckles. "He looks more like a man who hauls things than a man who whips others to do his hauling," thought Dasha. Bessie Watkins held up the knife for an uneasy moment. "Don't know about no property, but do know that anyone crossing here will be cut in 2, she said, plunging the knife into the door jamb for emphasis. Isaiah Watkins stepped out of the crowd and walked up to the door of his mother's cabin. Dasha knew Isaiah as a gentle man, unless he felt wronged or angered. Then he could be meaner than a polecat. "Now, Sheriff, what's this here fuss you're stirring up that's disturbing my mama?" His words came slow and stiff, as if talking was an effort he wasn't used to. It was all part of the plan. "I got a writ here," said the sheriff, reaching into his pocket, "that gives me the authority to search her premises for stolen property." "Mighty fancy language," said Isaiah playfully. Then his voice turned stern. "But what does this mean?" Dasha's aunt and his cousins, who were about Dasha's size, wended their way to the front of the crowd. When they neared Dasha, his aunt didn't even glance at him. She led her children toward the Watkins cabin. "Sheriff," the slave owner shouted, "don't explain nothing to that kid. That woman's got my girls." "What woman you talking about?" Dasha's aunt spun around and glared at the slave owner. "I ain't got your girls. These 2 are my boys. Or ain't your eyes good enough to see that they're boys?" She pulled off the wide-brimmed hats covering her sons' faces and turned the boys around to face the slaveholder. The crowd laughed. Bessie Watkins pulled the knife out of the door jamb, and Dasha's aunt shooed her children into the cabin. Then she turned her head and shouted at the slave owner, "Maybe you should look round and see if there's a hole in the ground nearby where they've been let down to the Underground Railroad." The crowd responded with more laughter. The sheriff thrust a paper into Isaiah's hands. "Read it yourself." Isaiah brought the paper close to his eyes and moved his eyes and one finger word by word across the paper, pretending that, like a child, he still struggled with his letters. Isaiah's wife led their two boys out of the crowd toward the cabin. When they were about halfway there, the slave owner hollered, "Where are those people going?" Bessie Watkins plunged her knife into the door jamb again. "Here, my friends are welcome in my home." Her voice was still defiant, but a bit shaky. Isaiah stopped reading, pulled the floppy hat off of one of his boys, and turned him around for the slave owner to see. Then he pulled the hat off his other boy and turned him around too. "Just wanted to confirm for that there man that you were boys too." The crowd's laughter was punctuated by a piercing whinny from the slave owner's horse. The angry man cracked his whip at the horse's neck to silence him, then snapped the whip on the ground. For the first time, Dasha felt scared for Cornelia and Selena. Isaiah reached the bottom of the page. His eyes and finger darted to the top, and he began reading again, as if he didn't completely grasp what he read. Another woman led her son toward the cabin. Dasha followed behind them. "Well," said Isaiah, finally looking up at the sheriff, "I don't see where this here papers say that you have the right to enter my mama's house." The sheriff grabbed the writ and hurriedly read it through. Then he handed it back to Isaiah, pointing to the paragraph that authorized the search. Isaiah's earnest eyes studied the paper again. "But this here is a writ to find property. I don't know of any laws in Indiana that say human beings is property. Human beings is human beings. Property is houses and land. Proving that people is property would be a difficult job for anybody, even a fast-talking lawyer." "I can prove it, all right. I have my right to them under the law." The owner's mounting frustration brought scattered laughing from the crowd. "I doubt that," said Isaiah. He leaned over, shielding part of his mouth with his hand, and whispered to his mother. Her eyes flashed. He whispered something else to her. Her eyes reluctantly calmed down. She sighed and nodded. Isaiah turned back to face the sheriff. "Sheriff, I have proposed a compromise to my mama, and she has, graciously accepted it. My mama here say that you can search her premises, providing that if by any chance you do find two girls in her house, you give them a fair trial to determine whether or not they are these here." He looked at the writ again. "Jackson, Selena and Cornelia Jackson," shouted the slave owner. His frustration brought more laughter from the crowd. The cabin door opened. Dasha's aunt and his cousins walked slowly out of the cabin. "Hurry up," Dasha thought. "We're running out of time." Dasha and the other boy brushed past them and entered the cabin. In the middle of the room stood two boys and Selena and Cornelia. Barefoot, dressed in faded rolled-up pants, baggy shirts, and floppy hats, the girls looked like boys. Dasha heard Isaiah acknowledge the slave owner with a big, "Thank you, sir," and then he addressed the sheriff. "Well, I doubt that these here Cornelia and Selena Jackson are here, but you are free to look." Bessie Watkins stepped away from her door. As the sheriff and his men rushed past her, Dasha and the girls walked right past them, out the door, and back into the crowd. They walked slowly amid the pine trees to the bushes. Laughter gurgled up inside Dasha as he pictured the slave owner rifling through the cabin, opening cupboards, slamming doors, pulling up mattresses, and swearing more and more as he realized that his search had led him nowhere. Samuel was waiting near the bushes. Dasha helped Cornelia and Selena up onto Samuel's horse. "Gentle now," Dasha whispered into Free's ear as he swung his leg over Free's back. Dasha didn't want either horse galloping. Noise traveled. Free obediently led the way, slowly through the bushes to the road out of town. When they were about a mile out of town, Dasha leaned over again and whispered to Free, "Come on, boy, don't let me down." And Free took off like the wind. Selina and Cornelia were taken 20 miles away, where they were hidden for a few weeks until the slave owner abandoned his search. Then they were sent by Underground Railroad to Canada. And that is the end of Free Like the Wind. So hopefully I'll have another story for you to listen to, and hopefully that story will be A Shipment of Dry Goods, which is a different version of the Henry Box Brown story. It's a bit longer and it's a bit more detailed, so I hope to have the chance to read that to everybody. So I will see you next time for another Read Aloud. Bye, 4th grade.